Hey there, and welcome to The Working Songwriter, the show where today's best songwriters come to talk shop. I'm your host, Joe Pug. Each episode here, we host a distinguished guest, and we ask them to go deep on their inspiration, on their process, on the general ups and downs of making a life in music. So, whether you're a grizzled veteran, flipping through scrapbooks of your old band and wondering just how you gained 40 pounds, or else a scrappy upstart, sitting in a van for 8 hours and then personally drinking a case of beer every night while maintaining the exact same body weight. This is your show. Because ultimately, it is what every writer seeks most, an ironclad excuse to put off actually writing. Hey everybody, it's the last Friday of May 2019. Thank you for joining us. This month's episode is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. I'm old enough to remember when you had to pay somebody called a web developer to get a website made. What is a web developer, you ask? I'll tell you. A web developer was a guy named Andre that you found on Craigslist who drove a tricked-out Nissan Cube and who would ask you what the name of your band was just so that he could tell you that he'd never heard of you before, and also so that he could tell you that he was once in a band that opened for the Circle Jerks in 1997 in Anaheim. That's who a web developer was. And then he would charge you $1,000 for a website that would be obsolete in like a couple months. But we don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to get Andre involved in our lives anymore because it's the future now, and that's not how it works anymore. We can have nice things, and one of those nice things is Bandzoogle. Bandzoogle powers the websites of tens of thousands of musicians around the world, from weekend warriors to Grammy winners. All the features you need for a professional website are just already built in. Hosting and a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates, tools to sell your music and merch, mailing list tools, social media integrations, and best of all, live support from their musician-friendly team 7 days a week. The Working Songwriter podcast listeners can go to bandzoogle.com and try it for free for 30 days. Just use the promo code TWS to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. That's TWS, the initials for this show, and you'll get a special deal over at Bandzoogle. So thanks to them for supporting the show. If you'd like to hear some of my music live in the coming months, I'm just going to be in one place, really. I'm playing tomorrow night, June 1st, in Columbia, Maryland at the Soundry, but other than that, I'm shutting it down a little bit because, as you'll hear a little bit further in the episode here, I'm getting ready to release an album, which is very exciting, and we're kind of planning a large album tour. So I won't be touring piecemeal. I'll kind of be touring all at once in the fall. So come see me at the Soundry tomorrow night in Columbia, Maryland, and otherwise I'll see you later in the fall out there on the road. Finally, if you enjoy this podcast, if you'd like to help it remain a viable endeavor for me, there's a few things that you can do to help. First of all, you could become a supporter of the show over at Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows you to directly support creative endeavors that you love and find meaningful. You just head to their site, Patreon. You search for The Working Songwriter, or you search for my name, and then you sign up to kick in a few bucks every month for the show. It's basically a voluntary subscription, a subscription that you certainly don't have to pay, but that you choose to because you won't miss the few bucks every month and you want to hear the bonus content that I post over there. So please sign up and do that. And if you're not in a place to kick in a few bucks, that's all good. I get it. I just ask that you rate and review the show in iTunes, which is free, or even freer than that. Just tell a friend about the show that you think might dig it. The simple math on those last two things is that they will help me much more than they will be a pain in the ass for you. So I thank you for doing those things. That's all the harassment that I have for this month. So thanks for being here, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Born Clarence Greenwood in Memphis, Tennessee, Citizen Cope spent his formative years in Washington, D.C. He began his musical career as the DJ for Basshead, a buzzworthy alternative hip-hop group from the district. Eventually, he signed a modest deal with DreamWorks for his own solo material and released an eponymous debut album in 2002. The lead single of that album, Let the Drummer Kick, went gold. His songs have been featured in a slew of television shows such as Scrubs, Smallville, One Tree Hill, and Entourage. They've been recorded and performed by the likes of Carlos Santana, Sheryl Crow, Dido, Richie Havens, and Eric Clapton. He has recorded for Capitol, DreamWorks, Arista, and RCA Records. He now records under his own company, Rainwater Recordings. NPR has written of him, quote, "The hallmarks of Cope's songs are his impressive ability to pair deep-felt grooves and a memorable melody with wondrous lyrical simplicity that goes straight to the point and to the heart." The Washington Post has called him, quote, "the city's most soulful export since Marvin Gaye." His latest album is titled after some advice he once got from Carlos Santana about surviving the music business. Watch out for the 2 H's, Santana supposedly told him: heroin and helicopters. Cope was in D.C. to play a packed Lincoln Theater last month, and as the band was warming up on stage for a sound check, which I'm sure you'll hear in the background a little bit, he was kind enough to give me some of his time to talk about his journey so far. Welcome back to D.C. D.C. looks a little bit different than it did when you were here 20 years ago, I'd have to imagine.
Sorry, let me just...
You're good.
I'm getting all these ticket requests right now.
That's what happens when you come home.
What was that again?
I was wondering if D.C. looked different, but what you were saying about ticket requests, I heard that a lot of times NBA players don't like playing home games because they just get blown up all day on text before the game, and they're not focused on the game at all.
Yeah, so. That happens.
You still got much family in town, or is it just friends?
Friends, family. Yeah. Everybody.
And does the town look a bit different to you than it did 20 years ago when you were getting your start with Basshead here?
It looks a lot different, right? And it feels a lot different.
Yeah.
There used to be kind of an danger, like a little bit of air of danger in DC, and now it's kind of been, gone through a big economic change. Everything in every city has, that I go to around the country has the same thing happening to it. And I think every city thinks that they're unique in that, but it's pretty much across the board.
It really is. It's always the neighborhood, just the first single origin coffee shop that always opens up,
Yeah, where the artists are, and then it changes.
But the starting artists, I feel like they find a way. Like everybody I know is in Philly now, because it's cheaper to live there. Everyone moved from New York to Philly that's struggling to make it artistically.
Yeah, people found new places to go. I think the rural communities, the smaller towns, have suffered across the U.S. because there's just been an exodus toward going to the big city and kind of finding your way there. And there's not much in the small towns anymore. No,
there's really not. And then the other side of that coin is the people that have been living in those neighborhoods for years, when they were neighborhoods that, as you said, had like an air of danger to them, they start getting priced out just by the property taxes because the property value increased. They can't afford the taxes on the place anymore.
That's what's kind of messed up, because the values of the houses go way up, and then they have to, if you're an old woman who's been there her whole life and now has this huge tax bill and she might be retired or something like that, that's a pretty hefty, price tag to have to pay.
It really is. It seems like there should be some way to grandfather people in If you've been paying taxes in a neighborhood for 25 years and it changes, it's just the height of inequality to kick people out like that,
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it was done by design in some ways, but and there's been that push. So I don't know economically if this is real or not. It could be just the start of something that even gets even bigger and bigger and bigger.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, it could be that people 10 years from now say, wow, look how much it's changed in 10 years. It could go up and up and up. But I think that when you have huge investment companies coming in and, building huge buildings and hotels and corporate restaurants and things of this nature, that there still has to be a way to sustain it. And one of the things that DC's been a transient city in some ways, and it's also been a completely residential and culturally stable place for a while. It had its own identity. Mm-hmm. So I think what we're dealing with in America is that we have a cultural identity crisis. I don't think we have a real cultural identity. I think that people have their own personal, cultures or communities, but we don't have, as Americans, really, we can't say what our identity is except for pretty much chasing financial rewards.
Do you think that there ever was a common identity? And if so, what do you think changed to put us in the current crisis that we are?
I just think our lack of being able to acknowledge other people's struggles culturally. I think people identify their own cultural struggle, and most people came here because they wanted to do better than they were doing in their own country. So if you were doing really well and you were in Peru or something, chances are you might come visit, but you might not want to live here. So I think that it became a money grab, and people knew that, and maybe that was the point of America from the genesis of it. But there was people that were brought here as slaves or descendants of slaves, and that I really don't know that, not just for them, but for a lot of Americans who's been here for generations, if there's any intrinsic value that came along with, building the country and building the bridges and all that kind of stuff.
Well, let's switch gears to a place that does have some strong community identities, and that would be the DC when you were growing up, because there was a lot of musical identities at that time that had true voices, such as, Discord and all the punk rock stuff that was happening. And then you also had go-go happening too. How much of that were you aware of when you were growing up in the city?
Well, I was a big Chuck Brown fan, Paint the White House Black, which had a lot of different go-go bands on it. And that was kind of like a best of go-go thing, with the exception of Rare Essence wasn't on there. And Backyard, I don't think existed back then. But that record meant a lot to me, and all the live recordings of Chuck Brown and Trouble Funk, and seeing them play live and witnessing that, and then seeing the independent spirit of the Discord bands and what they were doing as far as their live shows, and also what groups that were spawned by that became alternative rock and this kind of thing. All the way from, Dave Grohl coming from this area and ending up in Nirvana. And I'm sure he was heavily influenced by a lot of, I know he played in that group Scream, but he was obviously identified with the go-go and the punk rock thing, and there was reggae kind of tinged in that, because at punk rock shows there weren't a lot of records that were being played, or not a lot of punk rock records to play before the punk rock bands would go. So
Right.
they would play reggae music. So that would be an influence, I think, that stretched as well. So I know that the Bad Brains, I saw them one time, and they had to play some reggae tunes to mellow the crowd out because it was so crazy.
How did you become involved in Basshead? How did that happen? And what did that look like? Were you mainly in the studio, or were you on the road with the band?
No, I wasn't involved in the creative aspect of Basshead. Michael Ivey was the creative entity in that group. He was a great songwriter, made an amazing album in his junior year or senior year at Howard. And I had a tape, and I was at Kent Mill Records, and I gave it to somebody that worked at Kent Mill, and he was friends with Michael. And Michael heard the record or the demo, and he was like, "Really, I like what you're doing a lot. Do you want to come on the road with me?" And kind of gave me a real insider's look at what it was like to tour, what it was like to make records, what it was like to be involved in major record companies without having to make those mistakes, initially myself.
Oh, were you guys touring the nation? What did those tours look like? Were you in a van? Were you in a bus?
We were in a van most of the time. We did a small bus tour because he had a lot of commitments with press and radio. And we did a couple, bus tours where we were opening up for different bands.
What did you learn from his experiences there as just a member of the band rather than the head honcho?
One of the things I love about Michael is he's genuinely a good, amazing human being, aside from being a great artist. One time we were on tour with the Beastie Boys, and the tour manager got really mad because it was 8:02 and we were supposed to be on stage at 8:01. And he kind of, and the tour manager for the Beastie Boys kind of came out and kind of yelled at Michael. And Michael was, we were on the side of the stage, and Michael just said, "Well, hey," I think his name was Marty. He said, "Hey, Marty, well, let's just coordinate watches so that I won't be late anymore," because he genuinely thought we were on time. But, it just, instead of saying, F you and all this stuff, which, I'm sure, Michael is educated and was also politically aware and had his own racial identity as well as his own personal identity. And to kind of be yelled at by some tour manager or some white guy or whatever, like, I was from the experience where if anyone kind of came at you like that, you defended yourself, which is at an early age for Michael to have already known to be present enough to make that adjustment
in the moment.
Yeah.
Too.
So I think that really, I always look at that as being such a great lesson.
Seriously, because not all people who are great songwriters, like very different qualities are needed to be a good band leader and a leader, I think. And I don't think you need to have it in the same person. What do you think are some qualities that a good band leader should have? You've been one for many years.
Well, I don't consider myself a great band leader. I've seen Sheryl Crow in action. I've seen Carlos Santana in action, and Eric Clapton, and I've had to, just to be a fly on the wall and see how people run their organizations has been a learning experience for me, because I always had a hard time with stage fright. So I was always
Really?
Spent a lot of years touring where I didn't enjoy myself on stage because I was pretty much in fear, and recently just started realizing that the people are here to see me. So it's not like I have to prove anything to them. And if something goes wrong, or if I'm missing something, or I mess up, or someone messes up, to let the small things go is really important. But also to have respect among each other, and respect for each other is difficult to do.
When you were in the throes of it, how would that stage fright manifest itself before and during shows?
It just takes you away from the present moment. It takes you away from getting where you can get artistically and spiritually. And, there were those moments, but if the sound wasn't right, early on, or the monitors were messed up, and your mind has a tendency to race, and it's something that when you perform, you should be completely dedicated to singing those words, and one, playing every note is something, and listening and being aware of everything on stage, and singing it like you're listening to it.
Earlier, you heard Clarence talk about being influenced by go-go. Go-go music is the sound and the soul of Washington, D.C. With its trademark polyrhythmic beat, its robust horn sections, and its lead talker running the show, to hear go-go once is to never forget its indelible sound. And its genesis is just as unique. Post-World War II Washington, D.C. in the 1950s was roughly 40% African American. And at that time, in that community, 4-part vocal harmony groups dominated the music scene. They had campy names like the Marylanders and the Clovers. Now, those harmony groups gave way to a newer set of R&B groups in the 1960s, such as the Young Senators and the Dynamic Superiors. The constituent elements of the go-go sound were there, latent in the air, but the genre still needed its Robert Johnson, its Bill Monroe, its master practitioner who could give final form to its boundless potential. Well, go-go's founding father was a man named Chuck Brown. He took the R&B sound and introduced elements of Latin music, namely congas and rototoms. He eliminated the breaks between songs and had the band play for extended jams. And most importantly, he fired drummer after drummer until he found someone who could play at the laid-back, regal pace of around 60 to 80 beats per minute. His vision was vindicated entirely. Go-go became a sensation. And as the popularity of the music exploded, D.C. already had a ready-made brigade of trained musicians in waiting. You see, D.C. public schools had a proud tradition of football, and along with that came a proud tradition of marching bands. So the programs at Cardozo, Coolidge, Dunbar, McKinley, Taft, Woodson, and a host of other high schools had trained an entire generation of percussionists and horn players and reed players. Those players left the turf with their instruments and flooded into the clubs and also the non-traditional venues where go-go would thrive. Non-traditional venues being the squad room of the Kentland Volunteer Fire Department, or the Berry Farms Recreation Center in Southeast, or the outdoor venue at Anacostia Park. The music wasn't just the soundtrack of a community, it was the community. This is according to Natalie Hopkinson's book, Go-Go Live. She says, quote, "The foundation of go-go was a large, extended network of local and almost exclusively black-owned businesses. Mom-and-pop storefronts sold local clothing lines of urban wear, live recordings, and concert tickets. Graphic design firms created and printed advertisements. The city's most popular FM stations, WKYS and WPGC had nightly go-go hours. Go-go, the music and the movement, always remained on a relatively parochial level. Even with a few bands eventually signing deals with Island Records and Def Jam, it never truly went national. And recently, especially as DC has gentrified over the last 20 years, go-go has lost some of its popularity and also just been generally sidelined by the city's new residents. Just this last month, in fact, the tension between the old city and the new city came to a head. It happened when there was a Metro PCS cell phone vendor on the corner of 7th and Florida Avenue, and they would blast go-go from speakers in front of the store. Well, recently, a resident at the Shea, which is a nearby luxury apartment complex, called the store's parent company, which is T-Mobile, and asked them to have the store shut off the music. Well, when the store obeyed those orders and shut off the music, the community mobilized. A campaign to save the neighborhood's musical heritage began under the banner of Don't Mute DC. And even though go-go isn't as popular as it once was, when Backyard Band held a rally to save the music, 3,000 people still showed up and danced to the beat. When did Capitol come knocking on the door for your first deal, and how did that come to pass?
I've been doing demos. I was Basshead. Michael had decided not to do Basshead anymore, but I was always doing my own demos, and I made some demos and sent them out, and had a couple people that were interested on smaller labels, and it looked like something was going to happen, and then the woman decided she couldn't do it, and she passed my demo on to somebody at Capitol, and it was supposed to be the person would actually get the tape. Mm-hmm. But, man, that's back when you sent cassettes. And I had this guy, Marshall Altman, who was a close friend of mine now, was working as a scout, A&R scout for Capitol Records. And he was listening to the unsolicited box and basically going through all these tapes, and heard my tape and really liked it, and called me and said, call me back, and gave me an 800 number and
an 800 number.
Yeah, so it was back. So I got the 800 number and everything, and he said, I really like what you do, but that and $1 will get you a cup of coffee. So he didn't have any power to sign me or anything, but it turned into a demo deal, and I got like $5,000 to make a demo for Capitol. And then between the time that I delivered the demo, there was London Records, who was part of Polygram, came to a show. The president came and offered me a real deal. So then I had to go between Capitol and them, and Capitol ended up offering me a full deal at that point.
Gotcha. And when they offer you that full deal, you're working on an album that doesn't end up getting released called Shotgun. Are they calling the shots at that point, saying, listen, kid, we just gave you this deal. Here's the producer that's going to do your thing. Here's how it's going to work? Or did you have some latitude to work on that album your own?
It was difficult because I wrote my own songs and produced my own stuff at that point. So they knew that I had an ability to do that, and in a point of view and as an artist. So they came with a bunch of ideas for producers, and at the time all the big producers were going to big names, and also to like I had a moderate deal. It wasn't like a teeny deal. It wasn't a big deal, and so there was time that was involved in that. There was records that I liked, that I wanted to sound a certain way. So they never creatively challenged me, except that they wanted a single. and I felt like I'd had the single, and I did it a couple times for him again. And, you know, in retrospect, I think I was looking at it as an introduction into making this kind of underground pop music, urban folk that I do, and looked at it as a concept album, kind of more so than, all right, I have to give them a single for radio and television. And
Right.
and that was a big eye opener to me, because they eventually ended up dropping me. But I realized then that I would need something that kind of had the ability to, and I thought I had that, but more the ability, when you listen to it, it sounds like they can sell it.
Was that explain your mental space and your spiritual space when you get dropped from that deal? That had to be very difficult.
Yeah, it was bad, because I was, up to that point, I was buying and selling concert and sporting event tickets. You know, I'd go to the old Capitol Center or RFK Stadium, and sometimes I would travel and just get tickets off of people that were coming in,
Yeah.
and buy them for less and sell them for the regular price. Or if it was really hard to get a ticket, it would be above the price tag, whatever you could make in between that. And it was kind of I felt like, wow, I was done doing that, and then having to go back to that to sustain myself. That was kind of difficult, because I felt like I'd kind of gone clear, and then now I'm back in the same position after Taxman came, and you know, I spent most of my events. I was not in the best shape, but the most difficult part was having to make all new songs, because they have a re-recording restriction on major labels at the time, and I didn't get the best out of the deal. So I had to make a whole bunch of new songs. I rented this place on 9th and O Street, where we had like a community of rehearsal spaces in the alley on Naylor Court, and got this 2,500 square foot converted
Like a loft space.
loft
or-
space. Is very rare in DC, but and I put a drum set up there, and I just sang and wrote for months, and finally came up with Salvation, and then I came up with If There's Love, and wrote a bunch of songs that eventually became my first record on DreamWorks. And
So when that self-titled one comes out on DreamWorks, I bought that record day it came out at Kemp Mill.
okay.
Music. By the way, I was a senior in high school. I got it. Been a fan since. And did that feel like at that point, like to me and my friends at that point, it was just like Citizen Cope is a star. Like everything is aligning and going great. And did that feel like your breakout moment then, or was it later on down the line? What did it feel like when the self-titled record came
I
out?
mean, I think there was a lot of different breakout moments. And I think one of the things that an artist, or I was kind of stuck in, was operating in fear, and the fear of not, after being dropped, not being able to make the record. With the time I had DreamWorks, I had kind of a couple guaranteed records, and it was more a solid commitment from the creative people at the label, and the top people I really, really admired, like Lenny Waronker, and there was a guy named Michael Goldstone who worked with Pearl Jam, and Rage Against the Machine, who was over there. So both of those guys kind of worked as the A&R on the album, and they kind of had different styles. I could call Lenny and sing him a song, and he'd say, "Hey, go to the studio." And then Michael was more, "Oh, this is amazing," and then he would kind of sit on it and, we need another mix, kind of, "Oh, let's push this back." So there was a lot of the record being pushed back, the record not coming out, and I realized now that there was just not a really good promotion and marketing from that side of my type of music, which would have been difficult. You know, I can understand it because it wasn't something that was down the line. But, you know, some certain executives know how to make something that's left of center become center. You know, so, and by the time I had the DreamWorks offer, I had a lot of different offers on the table. So I had chosen them, and it probably wasn't the best choice, except for the people creatively that I thought I wanted to do the record with. And so there was like little moments I always felt that were just victories.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel just because the record came out and then there was a great article in the Washington Post, there's so much more that has to happen. I was still on training wheels because you could put a record out and you could be signed. They were signing 80 groups a year, most majors, because the consulate, everyone was trying to buy. All these big companies were buying record companies because so people were just, all right, let's sign 80 groups, let's get a couple of hits, let's have something on the books every quarter so that we can come in and look like we sold, you know, gross this much amount of money this year, and then they'll get a multiple on that number.
Yeah.
So it was a whole different game, and then, you know, some major corporation would come in and buy the record companies. So that was challenging, just because you feel good because you can make a record and you get an advance, but at the same time, then you have to convince the label to put it out. And if your distributor is not going to order a bunch of copies for that, that's a lot more money for the label to put out in marketing and promotion. So that record ended up really underachieving compared to what they spent on the album.
Really?
Yeah. And now it's done well. Right. Now they've got their money back. But they look at it more of a year or 2 year kind of commitment for a record to recoup the investment that they made.
That's actually one of the cool things that I think works about Spotify, which is you're actually rewarded for an album if people listen to it over the course of 20 years a lot. Like it incentivizes you to make records that'll be durable records that'll go on for years, you know?
Well, that's what's lucky about the records I've made. Were kind of meant for the long term.
Yeah.
And that's why the records that I have are still being listened to or still being bought, and they have a life, and they have a legacy of their own.
So you were aware of that legacy or wanting to make them timeless in a way as you were making them, or just looking back now, you say, okay, I was making decisions that made them durable, but I didn't know it at the time?
I think once I started listening to and following my first instinct, and that's something that I've had to retrain myself, because people's opinions sometimes get in the way of being able to do that. And so when you listen to and follow your first instinct, I think that's the most important thing. But I knew the songs would have the life lyrically.
Right.
But then you have to make it a record. So then you got to have it come out of the speakers and sound interesting and cool. And so that's another challenge. And then you have to have the performance. You have to nail the performance of it. And that's a challenge. So
what did those tours look like on the self-titled album? Were you in a van hitting clubs around the States, or did you tour much behind that?
I didn't tour too much. I did some opening stuff, and I would just go out with a little. They DreamWorks didn't want to pay for my band to tour,
right?
So I just went out by myself, solo acoustic, and then some songs I would run some beats underneath that, and they're like, "Oh, this is great," you know. So, and so I did some opening tours. I did a few little spot dates here and there. I did a few headlining, but I didn't make myself a touring artist until I realized how important. I knew how important that was from day one.
Yeah.
But it takes a group of people together to do it, and it takes financial. So when the Clarence Greenwood recordings came out, I had a whole new concept of just let me build regionally like I would if I wasn't signed. And
Yeah.
then also I convinced the label Arista at the time to press up the entire record for me, and I gave it out. So I was like the first one to give away like tens of thousands of copies.
Like at shows, you give it out? Like
I give it at shows. I give it when I walk down the street. Because people, hey, when's the new record coming out? And then you get sick of saying, go to the store and buy it. And then, when you don't have that, you're not selling that many records, the store might not even have any copies at that time. So, it was kind of a challenge to the person by just giving them the whole album. And it was hard for me to convince the label to do it, but they came around. It felt like that was it was the best marketing thing that we did for that record. And so it was, people would like it. People loved the album, and then they would play it for their friend. And then if they didn't like it, their girlfriend might like it, or and somehow it just kept on building. If I went to there was a bodega at Ralph's in Brooklyn, and he loved the record, and I just gave him a couple boxes, and he would give it to the customers. And if there was a friend of mine who really loved the record, I'd give him a box, of the record to send, to give to other people that might like it. And so I did this regional thing where I did DC, Philly, Boston, and Philadelphia, and I did a residency in all those cities once a week for the month of and I did it I think in August before the album came out. And by the time the album came out, all those pretty much popping.
That's really cool that you could feel that groundswell. People under 25 listening to this show aren't going to be familiar with the concept that music isn't just always free and given away. But at those times,
back then, people were really trying to get you to buy the record.
It was $20 back then.
Yeah, and so when you're walking around and somebody knows you're signed and somebody knows you have a record out, they're just going to ask you the question, and then it becomes just a conversation where I just wanted to just start giving the album away, giving it to people on the flight attendants, wherever we're going, because the questions, you're in a band, well, what's your name of your band? All those kind of things that kind of really don't mean anything. Just give them a record. Like, what does it sound like? Yeah, here. and so that was the first kind of, we were the first ones to really do that in a significant way.
Yeah.
And then there was other challenges, because when the record came out, Arista had folded and I got moved over to RCA. And RCA decided to put this non-copyable thing on my first CD.
I remember those. Yeah.
And it was they were just kind of guinea pigging me. And I felt that was a real violation to my fans, because the first people that bought the record were really upset about that. And as I would have been too. It didn't really make any sense unless you were a huge artist.
And you guinea pigging in the sense that you were like one of the first people that said, let's try it on this guy and see how it goes.
Yeah, let's put this thing on this artist. And because they adopted me essentially as an artist, they could make those kind of calls for me. Whereas like if they would have signed that act themselves, they probably wouldn't have done that. Like they didn't, I remember Ray LaMontagne came out at the same time on the same label, and they didn't do that with him, and they didn't do that with Rachel Yamagata. And he did it with me, and like, what are y'all doing? Like, I'm getting killed right here on the internet because people think I'm trying to mess their computers up.
Right. This month's episode is brought to you by Nation of Heat Records and, specifically, my upcoming new album, The Flood in Color.
Clap of lightning, I awake to a foot of water standing in my basement. Started rising, it took me under, the flood is come.
All right, I've spent the last 2 years hunkered down in the songwriting bunker, working with my good friend and producer Kenneth Pattengale of the Milk Carton Kids. I wrote dozens upon dozens of songs. We only kept a small fraction of them, and of that small fraction, we really labored over the smallest details of the keepers. Then we decamped to Nashville, Tennessee with a crack band, and we recorded the whole thing live. Coming from a guy who's painfully conflicted in interest, I think it came out wonderfully. But why don't you take a listen for yourself to the title track.
They tried to warn me, I wouldn't listen. And now all at once I'm drowning in my kitchen. My legs are broken from treading water. The flood is coming, the flood is coming. I tried to bark, I tried to reason. The sky was deaf, the rain was never ceasing. It's not some cheap bed I can cover. The flood in color, the flood in color.
The album is entitled The Flood in Color. It will be released Friday, July 19th. Head on over to my website to order yourself a copy on vinyl or CD, or head on over to Spotify where you can either pre-save the album to your library or just follow my profile so that you'll get a notification when it's released. All right, back to the show.
Think that things could work themselves out in the long run. Pay attention, heed the thunder. The flood is coming, the flood in color.
One thing that struck me when I was talking to Clarence was his ability to talk so evenly about past professional turmoil. The first label he was on dropped him because they didn't hear a commercially viable single, and then they kept all of his songs under a re-record clause. Another label was signing bands just in the hopes of being bought by a larger corporation. Yet another label foisted technology onto his CDs that made them unable to be ripped and burned. He speaks now about these grievances with a detachment that's indistinguishable from wisdom. He seems to acknowledge that other people have their own incentives in this business, just as he has his own. This reminds me of a favorite passage in Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. In this passage, the old fisherman, Santiago, has finally hooked a giant marlin and is waiting for it to lose its strength. It was dark now as it becomes dark quickly after the sun sets in September. He lay against the worn wood on the bow and rested all that he could. The first stars were out. He did not know the name of Rigel, but he saw it, and knew soon they would all be out, and he would have all his distant friends. "The fish is my friend too," he said aloud. "I have never seen or heard of such a fish, but I must kill him. I am glad we do not have to try to kill the stars." Imagine if each day a man must try to kill the moon, he thought. The moon runs away. But imagine if a man each day should have to try to kill the sun. We were born lucky, he thought. Then he was sorry for the great fish that had nothing to eat, and his determination to kill him never relaxed in his sorrow for him. How many people will he feed, he thought. But are they worthy to eat him? No, of course not. There is no one worthy of eating him from the manner of his behaviors and his great dignity. I do not understand these things, he thought. But it is good that we do not have to try to kill the sun or the moon or the stars. It is enough to live on the sea and kill our true brothers. This latest record is Heroin and Helicopters, and that's reference to some advice that you got from Carlos Santana of a few things to avoid as the pitfalls to avoid as a musician or an artist. How do you stay healthy when you tour these days? You tour a fair amount. So how do you stay, what are some practices you have to stay healthy on the road?
We try to play a little basketball. I like one-on-one full court just to get cardio, no fouling, no out of bounds. It's really not about a competition, but about the competition of endurance.
Yeah.
So that's been one way. I've, had tours where I don't drink. Drinking is hard, to sustain every day, and then, to keep your awareness. But that's been a real challenge for me.
Yeah, because the drinking, for me, the main thing with the drinking in a voice is you're not sleeping when you drink, or you're not getting good sleep, and that's a killer.
Yeah, sleep is one of the most important things. And even being on a tour bus, even though it puts you to sleep because of the hum of the wheels, it's probably not the best sleep that you get. And we usually we get on the tour bus after the show and sleep on the bus and get there the next day. So it's not something that is really built for a great healthy lifestyle, especially at this level. But I think that's why I have so much respect for people who have been able to do it for so long. And sometimes people give some of the icons trouble about like the high ticket prices, but you look at them and it's like, wow, nobody else, you guys are the last men standing. So you guys had to endure a lot of different pitfalls and also get over a lot of things.
I did. I mean, monitors didn't exist until like the 1975 Rolling Stones tour. So before that, they had nothing, to say the least.
Yeah.
And the avoiding drinking thing is hard because this is pretty much the only business where not only do people drink at work all the time, but you kind of get looked at weird if you're like, no, man, I'm good. I don't need a beer right now. I don't need a tequila.
Well, it's not just that. I think it's, because I really did some reading about it, and there's a great article in The Guardian about just what happens to a performer and the endorphins that come out when you perform, and then there's a crash. And I think that they their theory was that certain artists, to maintain that, got into substance abuse or overindulging in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And so that, just knowing that there's a chemical kind of depletion that people look to do something else. And it's also a social atmosphere, even though we're work, I don't call it work, but it's business. And so everyone else seems to think that it's a social and it's their night out, but they don't have to be there the next day. So it's something that you can easily get caught into. And I can understand some of my peers and past and present, and some of the new guys having to deal with that struggle. And also, artists aren't necessarily the most self-confident, or they have, or a lot of times their own personal life prior to their life as an artist has been challenging because of the empathy that makes them an artist. Also makes them feel the pulse of the people. And so sometimes people live with other people's struggles as well, not just their own.
And then use substance to kind of turn that noise off for a little bit.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that or just the boredom of it
Yeah.
after the show, going into something. But I think that not boredom. I think it's just you're on this huge adrenaline rush, and then you get off, and you. I think I got into drinking because I had the stage fright, so I was like, let me have a drink before the show.
Right.
And I was like, okay, let me get one during it, and then let me get one afterward, and then
Yeah, man.
then it's 5 o'clock in the morning, and you're still up, and you got to be up for an 8 o'clock radio show.
Right. Do you tour different now that you have a family? Are you touring less? Are you touring in shorter bursts? How has that affected the way that you do business?
Well, this one is like 9 weeks, so that's pretty long.
Mm-hmm.
I think 4 is good.
Yeah.
I didn't tour that much in the last 18 months, so I had to get this one. Kind of the country takes so long to get through, especially if there's places that know your music.
Yeah.
I mean, you can hit the major markets when you first start out, but then that kind of spreads, and then you're in Boise, Idaho, and you're in all these other places in Spokane, Washington, and places, Oklahoma City, that you didn't think were important at first, but there's fans there. So.
Yeah. And I bet a lot for you. If you have a day set aside to write these days, what does that day look like? When does it start? What are you eating? What are you composing on? Like, what does that day look like for you?
It's just like I was writing something after the show in the dressing room the other day.
Oh,
So,
okay.
I think writing is kind of an instinctual thing, and you know, you pick up your guitar and write something. It's just when the muse calls. I used to wake up every day, write, go to lunch, write. You know, that would be my thing when I wasn't touring. Now touring changes that, and one of my mentors told me that early on. He's like, write as many songs as you can right now, because once the road goes, you know, you're gonna need them.
So is that what that period looked like when you were in the loft writing the self-titled? You said you'd go there, you'd play drums, you'd sing. Is that more what that period looked like?
Yeah, and then when I moved, even when I had the first DreamWorks record out and I was in Brooklyn, I wasn't touring that much, so I was doing a lot of writing.
So what would those days look like?
Wake up, have some coffee, smoke a spliff, strum my guitar, maybe go out later for some lunch, come back, strum my guitar. I'd go to Jamaica a lot, where I'd start getting physical, run on the beach, and like do kind of 2-a-days physical, and also write, you know, during the day and at night. And then that was always really good for me to kind of woodshed. I think it's important for every artist to woodshed and not have. And it's hard to find people that in your relationship understand that. And so you have to be with someone that understands that there's a time to woodshed, and and then there's the recording process, which is very intense, and then the touring process, and it's a cycle.
Seems like it. Well, man, thanks for taking the time to do this. I wanted to tell you, I met you one time before, and you were very kind to me. I was playing the small room at a place in Birmingham, Alabama, at the Workplay Theater.
Oh, okay.
You were playing the big room, and we talked in the bar afterwards. I was like, man, you said, how did it go? I said, man, not good. There was no one there. He said, don't worry. There was no one there the first time I played. You know. Long story short, you say, hey, man, come have, you know, a beer or something on the bus. And I got really stoned before I came on your bus. There's some people hanging out, and the next thing I know, my head's in my lap, and I feel a hand on my shoulder, and I look up, and everybody's gone, and it's just you, and you just go, brother, you got to leave. So always appreciated your kindness, and I'll probably just schedule this interview just to tell you that right there, man. So thank you.
That's great.
Pleasure, man. Thanks so much for doing the show.
All right.
That's our show for this month. Thank you for listening. This month's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. Use promo code TWS to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Citizen Cope's latest album is entitled Heroin and Helicopters, available everywhere digital music is sold or streamed. Today's episode was engineered and mixed by Matt Schuessler. Research for the historical interlude on Go-Go came from the books Go-Go Live, The Musical Life and Death of a Chocolate City by Natalie Hopkinson, and The Beat, Go-Go Music from Washington, D.C. by Kip Lornell and Charles C. Stevenson, Jr. If before we meet again, you sit down to write, please remember, an expensive drug habit is not a song. A compelling Instagram account is not a song, and most importantly, reverb is not a song. So let all that take care of itself, and for you, just keep your eye on the song.